The President's remarks to the American Society of Newspaper Editors from the Statler Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., April 19, 1963.
Mr. President, directors, editors, 2 years ago tomorrow, we met in this city at a painful moment in the history of this country and in the history of this administration. I told you then that we intended to profit from this lesson, and I think we have. I told you that we intended to intensify our efforts on behalf of freedom, and I think we have. And I told you then that this government would not hesitate to take the initiative in this hemisphere in meeting its primary obligations to our security whenever that should prove necessary. And last October, we acted to meet those obligations and are prepared to do so again when necessary. In part as the result of last October's events, there is today more widespread assurance that both peace and freedom can prevail in the world. And while our vigilance cannot be relaxed, there is a tendency among many of your readers, as well as your writers, to devote more attention to our domestic scene and to the quality of life on these shores, and I think it's very appropriate that we should do so. Mr. Khrushchev has said that the hinge of history would move when the Soviet Union was able to outproduce the United States. Quite obviously, as the leader of the free world, as the keystone in the arch of freedom, as the country, and I'm convinced of this more and more, as the country upon which the cause of freedom and its survival in the world and its ultimate success finally depends, I think it's most important that we develop for our own people not only a more fruitful and productive life, but we also demonstrate to the world that a system of freedom offers an example which they can hopefully follow. Therefore, we must concern ourselves as part of the worldwide struggle, as well as because of its own sake, with the effort to build a strong economy here, to concern ourselves with the fight against unemployment, to concern ourselves with the fight against periodic recessions, ever increasing, and to concern ourselves, as I've said, with the quality of life here in this country. Unfortunately, too many of your readers find domestic affairs as baffling as foreign. Government seems too remote, too big, too complex. A tax cut they can understand, but the rest of this year's legislative program seems only a distant blur. They think it's for someone else, not for them, that it's an expense, not an investment, that it could all be cut out without harm to the economy or the nation, and it could be done in the interest of helping a tax cut. It would not be appropriate for me to review at this time the full scope of this year's legislative agenda. It is short, consisting of less than 30 top priority measures. And it is not expensive, inasmuch as their total elimination would reduce next year's $12 billion deficit by less than $2 billion. Instead, I would like to try to bring home the meaning of a few of these programs and to explain why I advocate them so strongly by translating them into the needs of that familiar mythical creation, the average family. I will go even further and place that family in the typical neighborhood in a normal American city. With the help of the Census Bureau and others, I want to describe to you a precise cross-section of America, a hypothetical subdivision we shall call Random Village, where the population abides by all the laws, including the laws of probability. Of its 100 citizens, 6 live alone, and the rest with their families. 10% of the households are members of a racial minority. The typical family income is $5,700 a year. Nearly half of the families have 2 wage earners at work. Most of the families in Random Village are homeowners. They spend their incomes somewhat differently than formerly, partly because their incomes are higher, and partly because the price of the things they buy have changed, some up and some down. Today, for instance, they're spending more on housing, automobiles, insurance, medical care, and the local newspaper. Since the village is governed by the law of averages, this must be a Republican paper. And according to the Census Bureau, the majority of the reporters are Democrats. The average family man in Random Village is most aware of the federal government around tax time. The proposed tax cut would reduce his federal taxes by about 20%, and the whole community would benefit from this stimulation. If his son wants to look for a job after graduation from school, he finds that his chances are increasingly slim, that unemployment in his age group is twice as high as unemployment among adults. And yet there is, at this time, no youth employment corps to help some of these young men start their lives fruitfully. If his wife wants to take their vacation by visiting a national park, she knows it will be nearly 6 times as crowded as it was when she was young. Nearly half the people in Random Village will go swimming this summer. But every year they find more and more of their favorite seashore areas reserved for commercial use only. Only 6% of the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast are now publicly owned. They want to hike in the wilderness, but the wilderness is fast disappearing. 24 of the 100 residents in Random Village are school-aged children. A majority of the adults did not finish high school, but they all want their children to finish. In fact, most of them hope their children will go for a college degree. For today, only the well-educated man or woman is equipped to work in an age of technology or to be a good citizen in an age of complexity. Among the adults in Random Village, those with higher educational achievements have a higher average salary as well as a lower rate of unemployment. Yet of these 24 children, only 16 will graduate from high school and only 9 will enter college. The other 7, most of whom are college material, will either find college too expensive, $1,500 a year in the local state university, or $2,200 a year in a private institution, or they will find that the college of their choice simply cannot take them. For our institutions of higher learning are caught in a financial squeeze. The post-war crop of babies is approaching college age. There will be twice as many college students in 1970 as there was in 1960. Without outside financial help, our colleges must either raise their rate of tuition or turn new students away. The people in Random Village may be mythical, but they are also mortal. Only 1 resident of the 100 will die during this year. 2 new babies will be welcomed this year. As a result, the average Random Village resident will call on a doctor 5 times this year, and on the dentist once or twice. 11 out of the 100 will have to go to the hospital, and many will wonder once again why we do not have enough physicians or enough dentists or enough hospitals. There are no physicians and dentists in Random Village. In the metropolitan area of which it is a part, there are only 9 physicians to serve 10,000 people. 15 years ago, there were 10 physicians to serve the 10,000 people in that community. In another 10 years, assuming the present trend continues, there will be only 8 physicians to serve that 10,000 people. This administration has proposed an expansion of our hospital and nursing home facilities and an expansion of our medical and dental schools, which will merely make possible the graduation of enough doctors and dentists and nurses to keep the present shortage from growing worse. It is an unfortunate fact that of the 100 people in Random Village, 10 will at some time need treatment for mental illness or behavior disorders. 3 can be classed as mentally retarded. That kind of tragic affliction can strike any home in the village, rich or poor, black or white. But much of it could be prevented. In a Random Village in Sweden, only 1 would be mentally retarded. Much could be cured that will not be cured. At least one of these 10 patients may be locked up with hundreds, sometimes thousands, in huge state custodial institutions in some other city, an unhelpful distance away from their own home and their own friends and their own doctor. This administration's proposals for mental health and mental retardation stress rehabilitation instead of isolation, prevention instead of detention, and comprehensive community centers instead of old-fashioned state asylums. The state and localities cannot afford to do this job without federal financial assistance. 9 of the 100 residents of Random Village are 65 years of age or older. In fact, 1 is over 80. 90% of them will be hospitalized at least once after the age of 65. Compared to the other residents of the village, they are much more likely to go to the hospital this year, and they will need to stay there twice as long. Yet their income is only half as great, and only 5 out of the 9 have been able to buy private health insurance of any kind, and therefore we proposed it under Social Security. Adoption of these new federal programs would not affect the independence or the vitality of the people of Random Village. Any more than other federal programs, their representatives in Congress helped enact. Programs which are also part of the domestic budget, programs which must be continued. We must continue our housing and urban renewal programs, for example, because 1/5 of the houses in Random Village are classed as deteriorating or dilapidated. We must continue our welfare programs because 1 out of every 8 families in the village has an income of less than $35 a week. We must continue our job retraining programs because roughly 1/3 of the unemployed in Random Village will be out of work for 15 weeks or more and simply cannot find openings for which they are suitable. We must continue our efforts against racial discrimination because the Negro families in Random Village are more than twice as likely to have poor housing. They are likely to earn half as much money. They have only 2/3 as much chance of finishing high school, and they are twice as likely to be unemployed. And neither injustice, nor crime, nor disease, nor slums can be confined to one group in the village. We must also continue our fight against water pollution because 31 million Americans, including very possibly the people of Random Village, live in communities where untreated or inadequately treated sewage is being discharged into their rivers and streams. In short, the federal government is not a remote bureaucracy. It must seek to meet those needs of the individual, the family, and the community, which can best be met by the nationwide cooperation of all, and which cannot be met by state and local governments. These needs must be met, and to take them out of the federal budget will only cast them on state and local governments whose expenditures, debt, and payrolls have all increased many times faster than those of the federal government. This figure here of this chart, which shows a comparison, the orange line being state and local employment compared to the federal executive branch, indicates the tremendous rise in local and state employment rolls compared to the federal government. The fact of the matter is that it's many times as much, and should be borne in mind, particularly this figure, which indicates that federal employment since 1952 has varied very little, while we've had an extraordinary rise in state employment. The fact of the matter is, if it were not for federal aid to hard-pressed state and local governments, the federal cash budget today would be in balance. The federal government is the people, and the budget is a reflection of their needs. As the nation grows larger, so does the budget. But non-defense budget expenditures are lower now in relation to our gross national product, roughly 7%, than they were 25 years ago. This chart indicates the sharp drop after the end of the Second War. These are federal payments as a percentage of our gross national product. This indicates that since 1953, that the percentage of the federal expenditures, of federal payments, as a percentage of our budget has been almost unchanged in a period of 10 years. In other words, while the federal budget has gone up, the gross national product has risen in the same proportion, and therefore we've had a level line for almost a decade. There is another aspect to cutting the budget which goes beyond the merits of each individual item, and that is the way in which federal expenditures, in much the same way as federal taxes, help determine the level of activity in the entire American economy. This is not some theoretical abstraction, but a hard historical fact. We all praise tax reduction because it releases money into the private sector, but so do federal expenditures. Through contracts, salaries, purchases, pensions, grants and aid, loans, and all the rest. To cut $1 of expenditures for every $1 of taxes cut would be to remove with one hand the stimulus we give with the other. Last year, for example, the rate of private inventory accumulation suddenly dropped from nearly $7 billion in the first quarter, a high level due partly to anticipation of a steel strike, to $1 billion in the third quarter. The American economy wavered under this shock, but it did not fall. And an important source of steady strength in the economy at that time was the increasing rate of public expenditures, federal, state, and local. Had federal purchases last year been kept on a plateau, as some have suggested for this year, and as was true in 1958, a recession would not, in my opinion, have been avoided, just as it was not avoided in 1958. In 1958-57, due to an arbitrarily low debt ceiling limit, there was a stretch out in governmental expenditures, particularly in the field of defense purchases. We therefore saw defense orders dropping from an annual rate of $23.6 billion down to $16.8 billion, and finally, in the end of 1957, to $8.8 billion, which was, of course, a tremendous shock to the economy and had a marked deflationary impact. Federal purchases, which should have been rising during that period, also dropped from $51.7 billion to $49.7 billion, and during that period, unemployment rose from 4% to 7.3%. I'm not suggesting that there were not also drops in the private economy, but if anyone will chart the economy from the summer of 57 and the fall of 57 into the winter of 58 and the recession of 58, it seems to me there's a very clear evidence that the tremendous drop in federal purchases in the defense area particularly had a great effect upon the recession of 1958, which had such unfortunate results. In that year, a stretch out of defense and other contracts, required in part, as I have said, by an unrealistic debt ceiling, caused the layoff of many workers. Those who lost their jobs and those who were fearful of losing their jobs cut back on their personal spending. Retailers trimmed their orders. Their suppliers reduced their own payrolls. And so the downturn continued, affecting in the end the income which are the basis of most federal taxes. Therefore, in 1958, as a result of this recession, instead of having a $500 million surplus, which President Eisenhower estimated, because of the recession, we had a $12.5 billion deficit, the highest in history. Now, we should learn from this experience and also from the experience of 1960. Let us understand, then, that every dollar cut in federal expenditures cuts even more from our gross national product. A cut of $5 billion now from the proposed federal budget, as many have suggested, would cause 1 million fewer jobs by the end of the fiscal year. It would offset all the benefits which the tax cut could have brought by then. And if that lower level of expenditures were maintained thereafter, it would eventually cause not only a recession, but an even greater budgetary loss which comes from a recession. I'm not saying, let me make it clear to Mr. Royster and others, that federal spending for the sake of spending is desirable in itself, or that our efforts at economy should cease. On the contrary, the budget I submitted to the Congress already reflected cuts of $20 billion from the amounts first proposed. Expenditures in this new budget, outside of defense, space, and interest, are actually reduced. Federal employment under this budget will not rise in the same proportion as the number of citizens to be served, and every agency in the government is going to be required to live with its ceiling. Federal spending is not an end in itself. It must be held to reasonable limits that are consistent with the needs of the economy, as well as our country, and the risks of inflation, as well as recession. But I am saying that carefully screened and selected federal expenditure programs can play a useful role, both singly and in combination. That to cut $5 to $10 billion, unless the private economy is booming, unless there is a good deal more bounce in the economy than we now have, or unless we are able by other means to fill the gap, a cut of $5 to $10 billion from the proposed budget would harm both the nation and the typical neighborhood in it. And that the right way to a balanced budget is to seek first a balanced economy. The tax cuts I have proposed and the level of expenditures I have proposed have been carefully fitted together with this objective in mind. And we cannot look at the history of the last 5 years without realizing, regardless of our political views, how important it is that the United States avoid periodic recessions. To move from a recession in 58 to a recession in 60 brings not only a sharp increase in unemployment, brings not only massive budget deficits, brings not only an increase in the outflow of gold and dollars. The fall of 1960 saw the greatest outflow of dollars and gold in our history, which was tied directly to the coming recession in the fall and the winter of 1961. With all that experience behind us, it seems to me that we should study with the greatest possible care the role of private taxes in our economy, the role of local, state, and national expenditures, in order to make sure that we take no action out of prejudice or out of ancient views which can tip this economy from its present chances of rising into a downturn. There will be debate as to detail. There will be differences of dimensions and degree. But I think we should get on with the main task of strengthening the American nation, of opening a road on which all of us can travel, to serve in the future as we have in the past, not only as an inspiration to the world, but also as an example